So as Bea said, I've been around a long time working as a consumer advocate, both for Consumers Union and AARP. And I was around Consumers Union working pretty much against the 1999 bill that deregulated the electric market in Texas. I'm not working for anyone at the moment on this issue, and the views I'm sharing with you are my own. My other bona fide is that I live in Austin, and I was without power from 2 a.m. Monday to 4 a.m. Friday. So I felt the pain during freeze week. No water for 2 days. So what does it mean when we say that the Texas electric market is deregulated? Well, the legislation that was passed in 1999, although it was not implemented really till 2001, so you might hear that date sometimes. It removed almost all of the oversight over the price paid by customers in the electric market, unless you were served by a municipal utility like Austin Energy or a cooperative. Otherwise, you were put into the deregulated market. But even if you are served by Austin Energy or a co-op, what goes on in ERCOT does impact you as well. So in the deregulated parts of the state, customers have a variety of rate plans to choose from. And these are also very lightly regulated. And before you heard about the $17,000 electric bill in the news and gritty, there were numerous instances of abuse and bill shock in that market. And in fact, there's a columnist at the Dallas Morning News that does lots of stories on this. So that was really nothing new. It was just an extreme example. So as you've probably also read about or seen in the media, there's very light regulation of the generation market as well, and that's where ERCOT comes in. In the past, it was the job of regulators to make sure that there was reliability and enough energy to meet demand. And in fact, most other deregulated electricity markets in the country have some mechanism to ensure reserves. But Texas is unique in relying almost entirely on price to ensure reliability. So ERCOT, you probably never heard of ERCOT before about a month ago. And now you probably hear it every day. So what is it and why is it important? Well, ERCOT has two functions. One is to keep the grid in balance, and the other is it's a financial market. For decades, we've needed to have grid operators in the country to keep the grid in balance. There has to be roughly equal supply and demand, and there's ways that they can ramp generation up or down to meet demand. And you may have seen in the news that during this crisis, we're about 4 minutes from a very catastrophic and costly total grid collapse because of the physics of the system, aside from the financial part. Because the wholesale market for electricity is deregulated, ERCOT also has a role in the financial transactions, and they serve as a settlement market, and they're also the market where providers make short-term power purchases. And these two functions intersect because, as I've said before, in the ERCOT market, price is the only incentive to build generation. In ERCOT, the thinking is that scarcity equals high prices equals a signal to build or a signal to turn your power plant on if it's not currently running. There's no mandates for reserves in ERCOT. So it's an energy-only market that doesn't get any incentive other than scarcity to build. And typically in ERCOT, there are a couple of hours a year with these very, very high prices. Usually they're in the summer. And those hours are like Black Friday for the generators. They make so much money that then they're able to cover their capital costs. So in simplest terms, reserves are excess capacity that's available to cover in an emergency. But in the ERCOT market, no one wants to build excess capacity if they're not getting paid for it, and they're not. No one wants to weatherize if weatherization is only needed for a few hours in the year and they're not being told to and they're not getting paid for it. In regulated markets, those things are taken care of. In other deregulated markets, there actually are some requirements and mechanisms to pay the generators to ensure reliability. Texas has the most hands-off electric market in the country. So what happened? In my view, this deregulated system and the ERCOT structure had almost everything to do with just how bad everything got in Texas. The system was designed to serve the industry over the health, welfare, and safety of the people who are paying for it. In fact, the ERCOT market worked exactly as it was designed. And you may have seen some of those comments in the press, and I completely agree with them. It worked exactly as they designed it. So the weather we had, as we all know, was very unusual for Texas, but it also was predicted for at least a week ahead of time. And it should have been no surprise to ERCOT that prices would spike. But that was okay, right? Because high prices mean that generators are going to respond. Well, no. In fact, the freezing weather and the snow caused problems with the gas supply system. It caused all types of generation to go offline, gas plants, wind turbines, solar, coal. Coal actually froze. One unit of the South Texas nuclear project couldn't operate because of frozen water. So everything did freeze. And in fact, the ERCOT price cap of $9,000 a megawatt hour, and that translates into $9 a kilowatt hour, something you probably pay about 20 cents for usually. So that cap was in place for the whole week. And my question is, how high did the price need to go to change the weather? Obviously, the price could have been anything, it wouldn't have changed the weather, and that was the problem. No doubt, even with a better market structure and one that had weatherization protocols in place, there would have been outages. And in fact, the states all around us had the same weather and did have rolling outages and other types of outages from the storm, but nothing to the extent that we had, because it didn't have to be as bad as it was. And then meanwhile, on the retail side of things, people think, well, like, what is my bill going to be? Anytime there's extreme weather, hot or cold, you use more energy to stay cool or stay warm, so your bill is going to be higher. For customers who have fixed prices, such as in Austin Energy, any of the munis, the co-ops, a fixed price plan in the retail market, in the deregulated market, your bill won't otherwise go up immediately because of these ERCOT costs, but they will eventually get passed on to you in one way or another. And I can go into more detail about that if anyone's interested. You've all heard about the $17,000 electric bill. Texas does allow variable rate plans and index plans for residential customers. So there are an estimated, I've seen like 30 to 40,000 customers in some type of plan who will get an especially high bill. And we're already seeing that retail electric providers are defaulting in ERCOT. And that's different than declaring bankruptcy. It means that they can't pay their the costs that they owe to the generators. And so then ERCOT will not let them function in the market anymore. And you know what happens to their customers? They get moved to something called provider of last resort. And you know how provider of last resort prices is set pretty close to the way Griddy's prices were set. It's pegged to the ERCOT market. So it's not a good place for consumers to be right now. Prices are low in ERCOT market, but it just shows how the market is not at all protective of consumers. So what's being done? I've honestly heard very little about protecting end-use customers unless they're very large businesses. There's been a lot more discussion about protecting the players in the market and pointing the fingers for blame. So what do I think that should be done to protect consumers? Well, immediately, the PUC should stop ignoring requests to protect consumers. There are requests filed by AARP and Texas Legal Services together to stop late fees on customers, stop switching penalties, have no switching fees, don't turn customers over to collections when they get these extreme bills, to help in just the immediate, because customers, whether they were on a decent rate, but they used a lot of power because it was so cold, or they were on one of these bad rate plans. A lot of customers are going to get bills that they can't afford, and absolutely nothing is being done to help them right now. In the long term, as far as what the legislature should do, don't dump the cost for this onto consumers. The cost implications of this will be long lasting and possibly significant. We've got to reform that provider of last resort rate that I just mentioned about. We have to do more for critical care customers. There are some problems with identifying customers who needed energy for their medical equipment or because of conditions. There's another thing that goes on in ERCOT, which is called uplifting the cost. So when a provider goes out of business, the losses that they've incurred that aren't being paid, they get uplifted to the market. And unlike in church, uplifting is not really a good thing in the ERCOT market. What it means is socializing the losses. So in other words, the losses get shared by all of us. So those costs should not be uplifted to consumers in the market. And I'm also expecting that any type of weatherization that's required will end up being paid by a surcharge on customers. Second big area, govern the grid in the public interest to require weatherization, plan for reserves, and plan for winter peaks. This is the first time we've seen this happen in the winter. And then finally, we need more accountability. And obviously that's easier said than done, because we can have great rules, but if they're not enforced, there's still no accountability. The PUC got rid of their enforcement division. That should be returned. The penalties for violations in the market are really very low for businesses of this scale. And ERCOT board reform, you've probably heard about. A lot of some of the members were from out of state, and a lot of them resigned. I think that's a bit of a red herring, because the problem is that a lot of members of the ERCOT board are members of the industry that is supposed to be overseeing. So it's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house. I think a better ERCOT board reform proposal would be to have members who are knowledgeable about the industry, but are in no way affiliated with the players in Texas. So that's my very high 10 to 15,000 foot overview. And I thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks. And I'd like to, I think let's go ahead and have Beaman talk. There were a couple of questions that were really specific before, so I will contradict myself. Before Beaman, before you start, there's a couple of really specific questions for Janee that probably we should just dispense with. One is, what other states have deregulated markets?
I used to be able to rattle them all off the top of my head, but they are primarily in the Midwest and Northeast. So Maryland, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York, Illinois does, Ohio. So it's this kind of swath across the middle and the northeastern part of the country. Very few states in the South actually do. Some of them that had passed laws when Texas did, like New Mexico, also passed a bill in 1999, repealed them after the Enron debacle in 2000. So California had one, and there was Enron, and now they have a mostly regulated market.
Okay. And then the other question, which I think I'm gonna put it out there, but then let's wait till Beaman's done and both of you can kind of respond to this. The question is, so who do you think will be picking up the tab of the high power prices for many hours? The retail electric providers in most cases have fixed price contracts with consumers. Is ERCOT obligated to see that each generation company will be paid the price quoted by ERCOT at the time? I've heard that's billions with a B. And what I would like to say is let's table that question until Beaman's done and think about the question as, so who do you think will be picking up the tab in a multi-factorial format? And with that, I will turn it over to my friend Beaman.
Okay, thanks, B. And thanks, Janee. That was this is interesting to me, and in terms of what happened last week, and sort of interesting. This is an interesting moment, I think, in sort of the Texas public policy space, because we've had a thing happen that kind of happened to everybody in a way that was unavoidable and undeniable. And these kinds of things sometimes create moments in the legislative space and in the general sort of public policy sensibility that are important moments. I guess I would sort of start where Janee leaves off. The week before last, there were hearings in the legislature that talked about these issues, and where ERCOT and PUC were energy generators were called in to make presentations in front of the legislature and sort of explain themselves. Last week began a set of hearings starting on Tuesday in the House Insurance Committee, and one of the major subjects in that hearing for a variety of witnesses was, okay, so what happened? What did this ice storm really actually do to us? What did it do to the insurance marketplace, and what did it do to policyholders around the state? Kind of like we know this thing happened, and we know that the event itself was, very difficult and in many instances extremely dangerous event, particularly its impact on people who had, as Janee was describing, medical conditions or other sort of critical care issues that were really not prepared for this lack of power. But now the question is, since the lights are back on and the water is back on, the question now is, okay, where's the rest of the impact of this event? What's happening now? It's sort of an interesting question, right? Because we had this big giant power failure that lasted not a period of hours, but a period of days in a whole lot of different places in our state. The temperatures in dwellings and in businesses went down to the point where even systems that thought that they were in some respects weatherized because there was an expectation that there would be heat in a building, that concept failed because there wasn't heat in a building. The internal temperature of a lot of buildings got really cold, and a lot of plumbing exploded. When plumbing explodes in a house, it can also affect, or a business, it can affect the electricity in that business. It certainly can affect the long-term health condition of that space. It causes a lot of physical destruction. We had, my wife teaches at a high school in South Austin, and the gym floor in that high school was under 4 inches of water. And their performing arts center, which has a nice slope for the seats, the chairs in the front were entirely underwater. And the seating sort of emerged about halfway up the auditorium from the big swimming pool that got made by the burst pipes in there. The answer to those questions that were posed in that hearing on Tuesday, there were a couple of things that were noted, and I was in that hearing, and I was actually testifying in that hearing. One of the first facts about this storm that was rather interesting was that this storm hit the entire country. It was a big storm, and it started on the east side and went to the west side, and there was this huge big push of Arctic air that came down and collided with a lot of wet air, and we got this remarkable event that we had. And it was cold and it was snowy all over the country, and yet even though more than 30 states had a significant impact from this storm, Texas had more insurance claims than all of the other states of the union put together. And the reason that Texas had more claims than all of the rest of the states that had been hit by this storm put together was that we had this massive electricity failure, that this had an enormous impact on your insurance system. Now, this is something that we all kind of know just by observation, because we're seeing the news that all these houses got damaged. Everybody in Texas was like, oh my gosh, when the water comes back on, are my pipes going to burst? Or have they already burst and I'm going to find out? right? We know that people lost lots of food. We know that businesses suffered severe interruption. We know all of these things, but now comes the part where all of these systems start to kick in claims payments and that kind of thing. This storm will wind up costing somewhere between, we think the best estimate at this point in terms of these sort of insurance systems and financial systems in the state, between $10 billion and $18 billion. That's a big range, right? The jury is way out on the ultimate cost of this thing. But it's going to be extremely expensive. It will certainly be the most expensive cold weather event in the history of Texas. It will likely wind up being more expensive than Hurricane Harvey was. It will be more expensive than Hurricane Harvey was to the Texas-only insurance marketplace, because a lot of Harvey was federal flood claims and disaster claims that were in the federal space and not in the purely state space. But most of what happened in this event is going to wind up in the state space. FEMA can come with grants if that happens, but we don't have National Flood Insurance Program paying for a bunch of this. I bring that up because it illustrates this sort of interconnectedness of various systems in the state, right? The electricity system, as it turns out, and actually put a pin in that word system because I kind of have something to say about that. But the electricity market, as we enjoy it in Texas, is not just about whether your lights are on or off when you turn on or off your light switch, or heating your house, or cooking your food, or all the things that we rely on electricity for. But it's about all of those things, the reliance of our property on those interrelated concepts, and then the financial systems that we have to protect that property or to insure that property. And so you have this really sophisticated interrelationship of systems in this state, and that interrelationship really gets illustrated, in a graphic way when you have this kind of event happen that really gives you a look at sort of the whole fabric of how we're doing life in Texas. We should really look at this because this interrelationship between systems is really important. The question is, how is this going to get paid for in terms of electric rates and in generator costs and that kind of thing? And that's a really important question. But there are a set of questions that go forward from that, which is, how are these insurance claims all going to get paid? And the answer will be by insurance companies. But the question is, will this have an impact going forward on insurance rates? That's a direct cost to people in Texas. The good news is that insurance is designed to pool for big disasters over time. But you still got issues. This storm was so big and the losses were so high that you have reinsurance costs in Texas. That is, this really big, the huge global companies that actually insure insurance companies have taken note of what happened in Texas. And there are open questions about the availability of the capital in that system to do insurance. And so there's this, it doesn't just stop when the lights come back on, and it doesn't just stop with an electric bill. And I think that this is something that you all, who are what I have always characterized as grass tops, and I mean that as a big compliment, informed citizenry understand this and understand these costs and the costs associated. But I think there's another thing that we should look at as we look at this, and I feel very strongly about this, and that is the drill down into the use of the term system and what we're talking about when we say system. Because systems, to me, if you have a system in public policy, it's this thing that you've said, okay, we're going to create a system, and that system is going to address a general public policy and specific public policy concerns that may arise in a certain segment of our life, right? We have long complained, and this is something B and I have talked about lots of times, that we use the term healthcare system in Texas when in fact what we have is a healthcare marketplace that is supposed to wind up being a system. And then we have these sort of ancillary things around the edges of that system, of that marketplace, that are supposed to basically be the catch, the safety nets for what the system drops. So the system's not really designed to, or the marketplace is not designed to serve everybody. It's designed to serve this sort of big bunch. And then we're supposed, the system-y part are the parts on the edges of it that are supposed to catch the people that aren't served by the marketplace. The same, Janee is teaching me that the same seems to be true in electricity, right? Where you've got this healthcare, or you've got an electric marketplace that is supposed to serve this thing. But when people get in trouble, there are these little systemic pieces that say, okay, well, you've got to have electricity. So we have an electricity space of last resort, where you can, a utility concept of last resort where you can go into this thing, but you wind up paying these really exorbitant rates. Insurance has insurers of last resort, which are these pieces and parts that make sure that everybody can get insurance, even though the middle of the market is served by a marketplace and not by a unified system structure. And so I think that it's pretty important for us to think about when we walk before a disaster. There was one of my favorite quotes by from the French Revolution was from a French noblewoman who said, "We gaily trod on flowers, never realizing the abyss beneath our feet." So before something happens, we gaily tread on flowers and are quite wise to have these, what we think of as systems, and then something happens, and then everybody starts pointing fingers and saying, wait a minute, there's really not a system. There's a market, and in the context of a marketplace, we did everything right. And you say, okay, well, then that's the question is, at this moment, do you say, no, in fact, you did something wrong, you did not fulfill your responsibilities properly. And so this issue is an incompetence by the people running that system. Or do we look at it and say, well, that person's telling the truth. In the context of their duties and responsibilities, they did exactly what they were supposed to be doing and exactly what they are expected to do in the system or market that we have. It just turns out that structure itself was not sufficient. And I think that these are questions that we really have to look at hard as we move forward and in reviewing this particular catastrophe. And then kind of look at other catastrophes that we've had. I'm a native Texan, 6 generations back. I'm super proud of the horrible weather of Texas and the sort of tough guy storminess of Texas. But it's bad. We put a lot of value under a lot of really bad weather and next to really stormy seas and in really dry places that go up in smoke every once in a while. And in Texas in the past 10 years, we've had a national record-breaking wildfire. We've had a national record-breaking ice storm. We've had a national record-breaking hail and tornado complex, and we've had a record-breaking hurricane. That's 4 years out of 10 that we have broken some monumental natural disaster record in Texas. That is really serious. And we need to look at why that is, and we need to look at what we really have in the context of systems. And we have to look at the ongoing true cost of these things, not just the snapshot of the failed thing itself, in this case, the electric power grid, but how that was connected in concentric circles to a lot of the things that are important to us and a lot of the things that we pay for. We need to, this is a moment for us to look at that. I think the other thing, and I'll take one more swing at this thing, when you talk about the sort of cascading effects of this, there's a good cascading effect maybe, and that good cascading effect has to do with kind of what we're talking about in terms of a moment to tell the truth, a moment to a moment to be true about ourselves, because it turns out that we are connected to these other systems that are external systems pressing in on us. I think it is very clear that climate change is one of those systems, that we have this worldwide system with worldwide implications that B is working on in a set of worldwide meetings. That system structure is having an immediate local impact. I think it killed the power in my dad's house. And my 82-year-old dad sat in the dark for 5 days. Now, he's my 82-year-old dad, Jack Floyd. So when his lights came back on, he said, darn, I was just getting rolling. But I was real worried about him. And this was a clear personal impact on me and on my family that was visited, I think, very clearly. Most meteorological scientists will tell you, by the weakening of the jet stream brought on by climate change that allows masses of Arctic air to get places where they don't normally go. And so that's a great giant global thing that got visited on my beloved daddy, who warmed himself up in front of a wood burning fireplace for 5 days and kind of hungered down and hoped for the best. And so I think that we need to take a good hard look. The good news is that there are realists in the world who look at that from all directions politically, who just say, look, we're just interested in what's real. And the aforementioned international reinsurance marketplace is one of those places. They're going to take a good hard look at Texas and say, is Texas really able to support its 21st century lifestyle and not have the whole thing just clobbered time and again? And do we need to make some decisions based on how Texas sort of does its thing? We had a big test of our electric system and we didn't do too well. And we are not the only people interested in that success or failure. And so I think that we have to be grown up about it, take a good hard look at ourselves and say, what kind of systemic reform do we need in Texas, including sort of a political philosophy reform that will lead to more resilient structures and fairer structures for our communities.
Well, thanks for that. And we are starting to get a lot of questions. So there's a question that Lisa Brenskelly has asked in the chat, and I know, and we have other questions in the Q&A, and I'm gonna get to all of them, I think. But her question is, we have all these vulnerabilities. How do we get the legislature to take action to build resilience? And what I think is really crucial here is maybe to start with both of you giving a little thumbnail of what you think resilience looks like. And, can we have resilience through one lens, but not through all lenses? And how do we make sure, as people of faith, we would be interested in resilience for everyone, not just for some systems or markets or structures? So maybe I'll start with Beaman and then Janee.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always this sort of coming back at you. There are a set of tensions in this, right? And so one of the little focus on housing. There's the idea of, well, you can build yourself a house that can withstand virtually anything, but it's so expensive that affordable housing is dead if you do that, right? And so there's this sort of extreme concept of argument that creates what I consider to be an absolute fiction. And that is that affordable housing is substandard housing, or conversely, resilient housing is expensive housing, right? That rich people can afford to be resilient and poor people cannot. One of the other weird hobbies I have is that I'm the vice president of Habitat for Humanity Texas. We are right now working on a set of op-eds that are based on what we saw here, that the title of which are going to be affordable housing is not substandard housing, and we can prove it. that there are a bunch of things that you can do that are incremental things. And the way we prove it is by pictures, by our experience in this storm and the number of claims, by experience in Harvey and the number of claims, and the resiliency of the habitat structures, because habitat has this concept of the resilient community built into its DNA, frankly. And so the question becomes, for a very modest investment of $3,000 in the building of a house, a very low percentage, can you increase the resiliency of that structure by a lot more of a percentage than that would be the cost of building the house? And the answer is not only yes, but you'd be amazed how much you can do. So I think that part of what we have to do is just really understand that communities and housing and these things are not disposable. We just can't afford this idea that the thing blows down and you rebuild it. We have to start thinking about the wind blows and the thing's still there afterwards, or the flood comes and the thing's still there, or the ice falls and the thing's still there, right? The electricity goes off and the thing has systems built into it that make it so that that doesn't create the cascading effect of that power outage, right? And so I think we need to get really serious about looking at low cost incremental increases to the individual resilience of our community, and then making things like land use decisions and other pretty simple, not gore anybody's ox too bad, but incrementally decreases the vulnerability of these places. And then from the other end of it, take a good honest look at climate change and say, hey, there are things that we can do, and starts with saying the word or the term and believing it. And then we start making plans based on a recognition that it's a true life thing. And so I think that that's what we have to do. It's incremental. You don't have to break the bank, but you have to start doing stuff on a broad front right now.
Yeah, I agree with much what Beaman said. For me, in thinking about resiliency in this maybe narrow area of electricity, although it does, as Beaman said, cascade out, I feel like that's very short-term thinking about, like, for example, even those plans that we talked about, the variable rate plans. I didn't listen to all of the hearings, but at times I heard them say, well, it's only 1% of the customers or less, it's only X thousand customers. Well, those are people with real lives who got extraordinary bills. And even if you weren't in those rate plans, for a variety of other reasons, you got a very high electric or natural gas bill. And then that's separate from whether your pipes also froze and you got a lot of other costs you need to deal with in your life. So instead of like, oh, it was only so many people or so here or there, how can we make the system resilient for the people who are using it so that no one has to face that kind of a crazy bill, so that no one has to worry exceedingly about their elderly parents or neighbors or friends being without power for several days when it's very cold, so that we know who the critical care customers are and have systems in place to help them. To me, that would be a resilient system, one that took it from that looks at the perspective of the end use customers and specifically residential customers.
I mean, I think what both of you are saying, resilience is not, I really appreciate that, Janee, that it's when we talk about, well, it's just a few people, but Beaman's resilience was impacted by his concern for his dad. Our community resilience depends on all of us getting what we need. So I think it's a really important observation. So Brian has a question. Is it fair to say that climate change has brought and will continue to bring extreme weather events such as Hurricane Harvey and the recent freeze? Beaman, do you want to say, what does the insurance industry globally say about that?
Yes.
There you go. Anything more?
No, I mean, it's an interesting thing when you've got all the steely-eyed Swiss guys with all the money in the world have climate change pages on their websites. So if you look at Swiss Re and Janee and you look at these guys, now their actual participation in climate change space is, as B and I have discussed many times, the question is, how do you get those cats bringing their steely-eyed, expensive suits into the room and saying, and something must be done? But they're certainly not in this space of debating whether it's true or not. And so I think that that's a thing, right? I think you have to, on Tuesday, I used the words climate change and community resilience in a House Insurance Committee hearing and got out with my skin, because it's true, right? I mean, I didn't get out without being questioned, and I was happy to answer those questions because I think they're important. Conversely, I saw some testimony related to directly related to the electric utilities in the previous week, where a person who knows better was testifying about the weather in Texas and refused to use the term climate change because for fear of sort of igniting a spark in the committee that he was worried he wouldn't be able to put out, and or be a distraction from what was going on. That's no good. We cannot be so afraid of a term that the preponderance of scientific evidence suggests is true. We're so afraid you actually literally wouldn't say the words in a committee hearing. That's unacceptable. And so we have to start saying stuff, man.
Well, that reminds me of an exchange I saw in one of the electric hearings that I watched, where a senator started to ask about climate change. He got cut off. We're not talking about that, said the chair.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was both comical and sad. But my observation nationally about the electric industry, at least, is they are, as Beaman described the insurance industry, they are already thinking that we're in this world that we have to change, and we have to change. Even if legislatures and commissioners are not talking about that yet. You'll see there's a lot of renewable energy in ERCOT, and it's not because anyone is forcing it. There are utility companies, national utility companies, that have their plan for decarbonization or their plan to get to net zero by X. And it's not even like they're fighting with the environmentalists about doing it. They're fighting over 5 or 10 years time, right? So the debate has completely changed from yes, no to, well, this is how soon we can do it. So yeah, why aren't our lawmakers there?